Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light, the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of humans, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth, the gospel of the Lord.
Praise you, O Christ.
Please be seated. Again, we welcome you to New Place Church. We're glad to be together on Christmas Day. Let us pray. Lord God, for the gift of your word, we do give thanks. And we ask that through the power of your Holy Spirit, this word might come alive to each and every one of us today, and also to us as a community that you have made for this time and place. In Jesus' name, let everyone say amen. Every once in a while in Washington, D.C., you get these moments where it's real still and quiet. And it always seems rather unusual. Because this is a church on a busy thoroughfare, so you can sit in here or sit in our little chapel, and you definitely hear the buses, and sometimes the construction vehicles, and the garbage trucks, and the people. You hear all of this, so stillness is something, when it comes, you pay attention to it in Washington, D.C. And as I've been pondering my own longing for stillness in Washington, anyone else longing for stillness in Washington? Yes. Amen. The hymn that came to mind is the hymn called "O Little Town of Bethlehem." And I'm going to invite you, and there's some hymnals in your seats. So look at this with me. It's in the back of the book, hymn 279, "O Little Town of Bethlehem." This set of words, the words from this hymn was written in, put to music in 1868, but it was a result of an Episcopal priest who was from Philadelphia, who traveled to the Holy Land in 1865, and he spent time in Bethlehem. And he just had this experience of the town. And so I'm going to sing to you the first verse, and you may join me if you like. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie, above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. Yet in thy dark street shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all thy years are met in thee tonight. You get a sense of what Reverend Brooks experienced when he was in Bethlehem, the place where we talk about Jesus being born. There was something about the city, the space, the place, the history, and the sense that God's Son Jesus still is present and still being born there. There's a wonder about the space, and there is a reverence for this historic location. It also reminds me, though, of Psalm number 46, which was Martin Luther's favorite psalm, and Martin Luther, who's posing for us in the stained glass window, as well as the statue out front. This really raucous guy who was able to really rev up the Reformation, also had as his favorite Psalm 46, which starts off also really, you know, God is my fortress and the one who keeps me safe, and all of this movement. And then you get to the end of the Psalm, and there are some lines that say, "Be still and know that I am God." So somehow, something having to do with the stillness also is able to give the reformer Luther the energy as well as the tenacity to bring reform to the church in a way that results in part us being here today. And so there's something about stillness. And this reading of the Gospel of John today for Christmas Day does not give us what we had last night. It was Luke, and we had actually acted out for some of our young people and children. We actually had Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus, who also is known as Jocelyn Rose. And we had some shepherds, and we had an angel. And so that is not how Jesus is offered to us in this Gospel of John. We have this mysterious poetry that tells us about who Jesus is. In fact, Jesus is not just in that baby who we hear about. It seems as if Jesus, through the Christ, has been part of God all along. So there is a mystery about this. Yet we hear this mystery begins to sort of settle down in this beginning of John. And we get to verse 14, where we hear about how Jesus is that Christ made real in a baby. And we hear in verse 14, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. So there's something really tangible about God coming and being in this baby Jesus. And if you do a little bit unpacking about what this is in the language of Greek, you get that what the scripture is poetically telling us is that somehow that Jesus comes and makes like a tent with us, or a tabernacle, a place where the holy resides. One of the translations of this, verse 14, has Jesus moving into the neighborhood. So what would that be like on 14th Street? Jesus moving in to the neighborhoods. In our frantic DC, which it mostly is frantic, right? Not just because there's a lot of construction going on, there's just a lot going on. This stillness moving into the neighborhood, well, I'm not sure that that is even possible. We're within 7 blocks of the White House, so I'm not sure how that could happen. However, it seems as if it has happened in Jesus. It seems as if the writer of this hymn has received that sense of the town of Bethlehem. So maybe something even could happen in Washington, D.C. I think back to the history of Washington, and it was when the Reverend Brooks wrote the words to this hymn. It was 1865, so that's the end of the Civil War. But it's after the Emancipation Proclamation, which is 1863. That's when enslaved people were freed in Confederate states, and there were a lot in this neighborhood of free black people who were in refugee camps. So imagine in 1863 what this area was like. And this church was built in 1873. So you have this area where a lot of life is churning and trying to figure out how to be. And then you have 1868, where this song is put to a melody. And then that's when the Civil War has ended and everyone has to figure out, what do we do next? The swirling of this time in Washington, D.C. must have been remarkable. So for a group of people to decide they were going to build a church right here, they were going to do that after the Civil War too, also giving thanks for the end of this country enslaving people. And so there is something about stillness that I think still, even where we are located, is accessible to us today. The stillness that helps us to see and hear and feel and touch Jesus Christ. And a stillness that allows us to nurture faith in God who loves us more than we can imagine. And a God who loves the world, the entire world, more than makes sense to any of us, and more love than the world deserves. And so, I've been thinking a lot about the atmosphere in Washington during the season of Advent. And in Advent, we had the theme of longing. So I was really happy to be able to turn to some John Lennon songs because I'm a baby boomer. Amen. Yay, boomers, right? So we were able to get into the song, you know, John Lennon singing with Yoko Ono. All we are saying is give peace a chance, right? Isn't that great? It's so current too. And then we had, you know, also when we're trying to figure out what is it that this time does to us. Like, we don't really reside in stillness very much. We sort of reside in what's clenched. We reside in fear and anxiety. And so there's something about opening up our imaginations to God's grace. So we were able to pull out the song from John Lennon. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. Nothing to kill or die for. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living together, right? In peace. And so we hear also in this hymn, I think, something that allows us to keep coming back to the practices that perhaps allow us to receive God's grace and God's stillness. Because we, in this last verse of A Little Town of Bethlehem, I'm going to sing it and I invite you to join me. O holy child of Bethlehem, descend to us, we pray. Cast out our sin and enter in, be born in us today. We hear the Christmas angels the great glad tidings tell. Oh, come to us, abide with us, our Lord Emmanuel. So I'm going to end by telling a story about last night. Because last night we had 2 services, and my musical companion in it, Justin Fish, had magnificent music at each of the services. And we had a very lively crowd at the earlier service, and a smaller and more, maybe more contemplative crowd at the later service. And so we made it through the first service, and you know, I really, I love a microphone, I love the chance to preach, I love being dramatic, and really got it going at the 5 o'clock service, right? We're doing this stuff with movement, and so it was really had an energy about it. And by the time we got to the 10 o'clock service, I am a morning person. There was no amount of revving up with chocolate that I could have done earlier in the evening to get me going, so it had a different vibe to the whole thing. And so I preached a sermon that was pretty good, but I had not the same level of audience participation that I did at 5 p.m. Justin was brilliant as always, and you know, as I love to say that, you know, when his gold shoes move over, because he's wearing gold shoes, move over the pedals, it's like sparkles, right? It's glitter, it's just beautiful all over the place. We made it through the service to the place where it was time to light the candles. And so the person that we added to be part of worship leadership last night was someone who was doing American Sign Language interpretation, because we had someone reach out to us and ask for accommodation, and we were able to receive that gift from one of our colleagues last night. So we're all up here, we're up and we're lighting the candles for the singing of Silent Night, Holy Night. So there's a little glitch with the lights going down too fast. You know, while we're lighting the candles, no one can see a thing. You know, I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. You know, because now it's after 11 and I'm really fading. And so then the candles get lit and we have the time where we're singing. And then what I've learned to do is to take some silence with the candles lit and to just be with each other. So we got to that place and took some silence together, and it's now about like 11:15. Took some silence together, and then Catherine, our amazing assisting minister, sort of did the final dismissal. And everyone was standing holding their candle, and then everyone sat down. I'm like, what is going on here? So I waited a moment and everyone sat down. Justin was at the piano and began playing his prelude, which was quiet and beautiful. So he's playing. Everyone's sitting in their seats with the candles lit. I'm like, this is liturgically unusual. So I said, you may extinguish your candles and you are dismissed. Well, people extinguished their candles, and then they sat there. I said to one of the ushers at the back, I said, like, what is going on? I said, I've never seen this before. She said, people are enjoying themselves. And so we sat, listened to Justin play, and when he concluded, and it was pretty long, when he concluded, people just got up and left. So I took that with me overnight, and I know that, you know, when you're a pastor, you got like the sermon jam up, right? You got to preach Sunday, then you're going to preach Tuesday, and then you're going to preach Wednesday. You sort of don't always get the next one until it's just about for the next one. So this morning I'm going, oh God, this sermon is no good. Like, you know, I really don't have it. It's stillness and everything. And as I'm preparing, just this morning, the Holy Spirit said, well, you received a gift last night of stillness in Washington, D.C. It wasn't orchestrated by our very good movements. Everything was already sort of over. We had come together on a journey, and we remained in stillness in Washington, D.C. And so I close with reminding us of some of the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's in the window here, who himself really relied on his faith during the time that the Nazis were in charge of Germany. And he was part of resisting that way of following any kind of political leader. And he found himself rooting and grounding in the stillness of Christ, particularly in his last days when he was in prison before he was executed for being a traitor. He was a Lutheran pastor. And in some of his writings, he talks about Christ and community. And he talks about how actually, like, we think we're the ones that have to make community, but Christ makes community all the time. It's almost like it's a web across the world. And what we get to do ourselves is to come together and then to essentially let go or release ourselves into what already is. So maybe that's part of the stillness that we experienced last night. So the good news is that the stillness of Christ is a gift for you today too. The gift that we had last night is not just for last night's gathering, it's for a little town of Washington, right? Because we need to have a boost for our faith, that we have not been abandoned. That God is with us and God is bringing us and making us community with a stillness that we can take into every part of our individual and communal lives. A stillness in our work, a stillness in our relationships, a stillness when we are grieving, a stillness when we're working for social justice, stillness when we're working for climate change, or race injustices that we're challenging, or immigration, whatever it is, a stillness that God offers, a love that doesn't go away. And that, I think, is a good Christmas gift. In Jesus' name.